So while Barry's doing the introductions, there's this QR code or this hyperlink. You'll be able to access a document that gives you a stigma scenario, a case study that you can read at some point. I'm very proud of this. Does it work? Yeah. Ooh. Ooh. I'll sit down now.
Yeah. Good morning, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here after 2 years of trying to get this workshop off the ground, and it's also a pleasure to introduce Phil Hutchinson. Phil is currently Senior Lecturer in Applied Philosophical Psychology in the Department of Psychology at Manchester Metropolitan University in the UK. And he has, I suppose, been long involved in the Shame and Medicine project. And unfortunately, it's nearly 5 years since we saw each other last because of everything that's gone on. Phil is currently working on a number of projects. One is on Wittgenstein and Ethnomethodology, which seeks to remap the relationship by looking at how Wittgenstein and Garfinkel respectively both respecify both phenomenology and Gestalt Psychology grammatically and interactionally. This is quite hard for a medical doctor to say, all the a second project on stigma, which seems to advocate a return to interactional analyses of stigma. And a third project in collaboration with Doug Hardman on method in psychological research. Thank you, Phil.
So hopefully everybody's got that slide. Okay, so I'll say a little by way of preamble. I'm going to set my alarm. So actually, there's a kind of nice symmetry here. In 2009, I was on this campus, staying in the same hotel, speaking at a conference on shame and atrocity. And that followed shortly after I published my book, which was based on my PhD thesis, Shame and Philosophy. A few years later, I decided to work with clinicians and activists, bringing my philosophical work on shame to bear on the experience of living with HIV and the clinical and public health of HIV. One of the things that I found when I started to work on sexual health and HIV in particular was that very few people, if anyone, talked about shame. Everybody talked about stigma. And it kind of threw me a little. So I published a couple of articles on shame, co-authored with a sexual health clinician, an HIV clinician. And one of the things we said was that as far as we were concerned, any discussion of stigma needed to include a discussion of shame as the experience of being stigmatized. But it also led me to think the other way and to engage with the stigma research. One of the things I found was that, stigma research is basically initiated by Goffman's publication of Stigma in 1963. And anybody that knows Goffman will know that Goffman, was a pioneer of interactional sociology, precursor of people like Harold Garfinkel and ethnomethodology. But it comes out of the pragmatist tradition. And a tradition that I'm connected with is ethnomethodology, and that comes out of the phenomenological tradition. Garfinkel was a friend of Aaron Gavitch and Alfred Schutz. And so I started to think that way about stigma. Then when I went to look at the contemporary writings on stigma, I find that not only is most of it trying to make a case for structural analyses of stigma, which basically means some kind of theoretical analysis, but also that when people talked about Goffman, it wasn't recognizable to me who they were speaking about, because it certainly wasn't based on what Goffman had written in the book. They would say that Goffman talked about stigma being an attribute or a thing, when Goffman is explicit that the attribute isn't a thing. In fact, when he introduced it, when he talks about stigma being an attribute, the next sentence explains that actually the attribute isn't important because it's fixed by the interactional setting. Okay, so that got me interested in trying to argue for a return to an interactional analysis of stigma. So that's what I hope to do here. It might seem a little unconventional the way I do it, but that's partly to do with this engagement I've had with ethnomethodology and trying to think in that way, and trying to see that, you know, the distinctions we're interested in as philosophers are there in the wild if you look closely enough and you know how to look for it. So I start off by analysing a tweet. So here's the tweet. So Matthew Hudson is a gay man living with HIV who's an activist. He works for an organisation called AIDS Map. They have online events weekly. He's very active on social media. Okay. In October 2021, late October 2021, he tweeted this. Okay. Being open, proud, brazen even about living with HIV, we dispel the fear and ignorance that leads to stigma. Hashtag respect my HIV, no shame in HIV. So I want to say a little bit about this. So first, and perhaps most obviously, the tweet testifies to the fact that a life lived with, hearing myself once is enough. A life lived with HIV is still a life where one has to navigate shame and stigma. And that's despite the current prognosis of an HIV diagnosis in a society where you have access to healthcare. So it's like in the UK where healthcare is still, as I speak, free at point of use. Then an HIV diagnosis means you get medication as and when it's needed, and you can live a full and healthy life. Life expectancy is the same as somebody without HIV, and you can't transmit the virus. Okay, it suppresses the virus to undetectable levels, and the virus can't be transmitted even through unprotected sex. But even when that's well established, there's still shame and stigma, such that some people argue, some clinicians argue, that the shame and the stigma associated with HIV is actually the worst aspect of an HIV diagnosis, because in purely medical terms, it's a chronic illness now, and one that can be managed through medication. So shame and stigma are associated with HIV. That's the first thing we get from the tweet. Next, stigma as the object of shame. I should probably explain the use of the asterisks. It's, as it says at the bottom there, it's to denote that stigma here is used as a gloss, okay, or a category word. Stigma isn't a thing, okay? Stigma is not the phenomenon we're looking for. It's a category that brings together other phenomena. So the tweet links stigma and shame. This connection is not widely in evidence in the extensive literature on HIV stigma, okay? You get very little discussion of shame, if any at all. But philosophers and psychologists who work on emotions, who don't talk specifically about HIV stigma, they talk about the emotions having objects, the intentional object of the emotion, whether it be analytic philosophy of the emotions or phenomenological philosophy of emotions. You know, the part of the identity of the emotion is the object, is the intentional object of the emotion. Okay, so the relationship is an internal relationship. It's not an external one. It's not that one causes the other, that they have sort of external impact. It's that the identity of the emotion includes the object of the emotion. Okay, so the relationship between stigma and shame is the experience of stigma, okay, is internal to the experience of shame. So if you've been stigmatized, if you've been made to feel degraded or discredited because of your HIV status, then you've been stigmatized. Okay, and then you experience shame, and the stigmatization is part of the identity of the shame you're experiencing. Okay, it's its object. So to lay out, the term stigma denotes a category of acknowledged, enacted discreditation, degradation, and discrimination. This isn't an exhaustive list of members of the category. There are others there. You might put the experience of bias or prejudicial action, for example. But you can add more to the category. These are just the ones I want to focus on here. Otherwise, I'll have a long list every time I go through it. But you can see why people use stigma as a shorthand, why you would use stigma as a shorthand, okay. And in fact, to his credit, Garfinkel, in the last couple of pages, I think, of his book, he recognizes this about the term stigma. But again, this is something that people don't discuss about the book. He recognizes it's about stigma, and he said, look, you know, stigma is just a useful way. There's enough in common between all these ways people are discredited or degraded, whether it be on basis of being a member of a marginalized ethnic group or a marginalized group based on sexuality or having a physical disfigurement or something. He says that there's enough in common with the way these people experience degradation or discreditation that we can say of them that they've been stigmatized. Okay, and that's what he uses to justify talking about stigma as a category. Now, the background to that is he was having arguments at the time with Harold Garfinkel and Harvey Sachs, the founder of ethnomethodology and the founder of conversation analysis, about this, because they were arguing that no, you should focus on the individual ones and that stigma is just a gloss. So there's a sense in which he's having that discussion there. Garfinkel wanted Garfinkel's discussion of the transsexual Agnes that appeared in Studies in Ethnomethodology in '67. He wanted that to appear in his book on stigma. But Garfinkel, for whatever reason, we don't know, withheld it. So rejecting passivity and affirming membership. So in invoking this relationship between shame and stigma, Matthew Hudson, the author of the tweet, goes further. His tweet is making a declaration. He is, or he will be, open, proud, and brazen even about his HIV status. And this will serve to deny shame a foothold. Okay, so this ties into the grammar, if you like, of shame. Okay, the work being done here, okay, by somebody who's not an academic, is an activist. The work being done here is grammatical work, if you like. Pride is the antonym of shame. So Matthew Hudson is asserting pride in his status as a man living with HIV. Okay. Shame is characteristically associated with withdrawal from the world or closing oneself off, but he's affirming that he's going to be open. He's declaring his openness about his HIV status. And finally, we have the commitment to be brazen, a word for which shamelessness is often listed as a synonym. Okay, so the work he's doing here in this declaration, in this sort of short activist tweet, if you like, is philosophical work. He's declaring that he will resist attempts to discredit or degrade him based on his HIV status. He will refuse to acknowledge discriminatory interactions as reflective of his status as a person. Finally, rejecting stigma as an invariant attribute. Okay, as I said at the outset when I was talking about Garfinkel, you know, Garfinkel's clear about this. Stigma isn't an invariant attribute. It's not an, you know, if you are living with HIV or if you have a disfigurement, then it's not something that will stigmatize you in all contexts. Its meaning doesn't exist external to particular contexts. So it's in an indexical. Okay. So in one of my classes I teach, when I was teaching stigma at the university, I was trying, the week before, somebody had taken me to one side to say I needed to think more carefully about the examples I used in teaching because they could stigmatize people. So not knowing that the following week I was going to be teaching on stigma. So then I was thinking about what examples I could use to talk about stigma that wouldn't stigmatize any of the students in the room. So I thought, oh, I know, I can speak about neck tattoos. Okay, and I can say that, you know, so in certain contexts, a neck tattoo, you know, if you're walking into San Quentin jail and you've got, you know, certain neck tattoos, then they will elevate your status among certain groups in certain contexts there. If you're going for a job interview when you're released, your neck tattoos are likely to discredit or degrade you, okay? At the back, there was a young student with neck tattoos that spread up onto her face. So what do I know? I'm getting old, that's all I can say. So Matthew Hudson's short tweet testifies how stigma as a category term for acknowledged and acted discreditation, degradation, and discrimination is not about discrediting or degrading attributes where the attribute is understood to have fixed, discrediting or degrading meaning. Rather, attributes which are the locus of shame and stigma are indexical. That is to say, their meaning is connected, is indexed to how they are operationalized in particular contextures, in interactionally constituted situations in which one participates. HIV isn't invariantly degrading or discrediting. It is only so when it has been operationalized as such. Matthew Hudson recognizes this, and he recognizes that he has input into these interactionally produced contextures, and therefore into the meaning his HIV has. He is declaring that he will challenge attempts to depict his HIV as discrediting, degrading, or as grounds for discrimination, and will proactively proclaim his HIV as a source of pride and as status affirming. So there's one final point that Matthew Hudson, I spoke to him to say I'm going to be discussing the tweet and gave him, you know, the opportunity to say if he didn't want me to. And he said he was very happy, but he said, I am Matthew, very certainly Matthew. So apologies for the slip there. The final point contained in the tweet that I want to discuss is the phrase where he says, fear and ignorance lead to stigma, okay? In a very large class of cases, that seems to be the case, okay? Ignorance about the contemporary pathology of HIV seems to drive a lot of stigma, fear-based stigma, people not knowing that it's no longer a death sentence, people not knowing that people living with HIV have no chance of transmitting the virus if they're on medication, and their viral load is undetectable, okay? But I think the emphasis on this, and there is a lot of emphasis on this in activism, misses some of what is going on, okay? So recently in the UK, a famous former Welsh Rugby Union player came out and declared his HIV status to preempt a tabloid newspaper expose. And in the aftermath of that, a lot of the HIV organizations, the charities and BEVA, the organization of medical professionals working in HIV, did campaigns along with Gareth Thomas, the rugby player. But all the campaigns were framed as if fear and ignorance were the cause of stigma. And I think that's a mistake, okay? It's not the cause. In many cases, fear and stigma will be, but, you know, a conversation, there's many conversations over the last 6 years or so have been about Brexit this morning, you know, at breakfast, was that, you know, it's impervious to facts. Trying to speak to people who voted to leave the EU, facts don't cut it. You know, it was a value-based decision. And I think it's important to recognize that there's something similar going on with stigma. Often it's value-based, it might be opportunistic, okay? So we can say two things, okay? That there are instances of degrading, discrediting, and discriminatory behavior which aren't intentional or deliberate. That's the first thing, okay? The interactions can be discrediting without the person who ends up doing the stigmatizing intending to stigmatize, or intending to discredit or degrade. Okay, but they can do, and we'll see an example of that later. And B, there are examples of where the stigmatization might be intentional or deliberate, but it might not be based on ignorance of facts, but rather based on a value judgment made with disregard, ambivalence, or even contempt for the facts about HIV prognosis and transmissibility. Okay, so the values lead, as it were. There's a, it might be prejudice towards people with different lifestyles, for example. It might be an opportunistic way of seizing power in an interactional setting. Okay, it can be many things, but as people who suffer stigma in degradation and discreditation in other contexts, will often be able to testify. And I'm sure Matthew Hudson has experienced some degradation in other contexts, which are clearly value-based. So I think in some ways we've just slipped into this in HIV research, this assumption that it's driven by ignorance. But I think it's a kind of willful thinking. It needs to be addressed at the level of values and the way values are formed. So you've seen that before, my QR code. So I think everybody should have got it. For those watching online, I'll leave it for another 30 seconds. There's a link there as well to the side if the QR code doesn't work. But if you want to read that case study now, how long have I got? I've got 10 minutes. So if I give you 3 or 4 minutes to read that case study now, and then I'll discuss it. Okay, has everybody managed to get through that? Okay, so one of the things I'm keen to do with looking at stigma and returning to the sort of the interactional production of stigma is to, is to help our understanding how we can avert stigma, stop stigma emerging in particular contexts. Okay. And while the discussions of structural stigma allow, their authors to make, claims about how awful neoliberalism is, etc., they don't really help us see how stigma is produced in interaction. And even if the structural claims are right, the way in which that structural stigma will get played out and the place in which it's experienced is in interaction. Okay, so unless we understand the interactional dynamics or the mechanics of the production of stigma, we won't be able to actually address it where we need to address it. Okay, so this scenario, it's a fictionalized scenario. When I started to do research on shame and HIV, I realized very early at the outset that one of the problems was that people who experienced the most pronounced shame were also the very people who were unlikely to volunteer to be interviewed or participate in a research project. So part of the way of getting around that was to speak to people and tell them that I was conducting this research, but say that I wasn't interviewing them, that their words wouldn't get taken down, that they would, they wouldn't be kept on record, and that I would produce these kinds of fictionalized examples from what I learned. Another side of this is, I think there's a, my philosophical background is in Wittgenstein, and I think these kinds of imagined examples, and in the work of Frank Ebersole as well, these imagined examples allow you to explore the grammar, okay, and the connections between things and the situations in which certain utterances make sense. And so I wanted an example that would somehow allow us to think about the interactional dynamics of stigma by showing a scenario where the goal is that we have to try and solve a puzzle. We have to try and understand the contexture in which that utterance, that behavior makes sense. Okay, so you've got this scenario, which is a clinical setting in which you've got the doctor, the female doctor, and the female patient, Carolina. Carolina is a person living with HIV. This is the first time she's seen this particular doctor, but she's a regular visitor to this health center. Okay, so they start off and everything's going well. It's a mundane clinical encounter, and they're, in conversation analytic terms, they're both co-producing the conversational contexture, if you like, such that they're taking turns as an unfolding sequence of utterances, questions elicit answers, and so on. And everything's going fine. And there seems to be a discord that emerges, okay, a divergence of contextures, if you like. So what's the path to that discord? What's the path to the divergence? Okay, so because what we're seeing is the same words are oriented to differently. Okay, so the doctor's utterances are clearly still mundane and unremarkable to the doctor, but they're clearly having some, and the doctor's actions, but they're clearly having some quite significant impact upon Carolina. So there's a kind of divergence of contextures that are contextualizing those words and actions. And it's by understanding both what those divergent contextures are and how there comes to be this cleavage that means that from there being a shared contexture, there's this divergence of contextures is what we're interested in here. So the path to the discord is that we have these three actions. The doctor's aborted re-engagement in the ongoing conversation. So the doctor turns in her chair to speak to Carolina, but aborts that turning, goes back to the screen. Carolina sees this okay? And then the doctor then turns again and then re-engages in the conversation. As she's broken off the engagement to look at the screen, the smile goes from her face, then she re-smiles, if you like, as she then reinitiates the turn to Carolina. So there's a visible case here of the doctor's attention being grabbed by something on the screen for Carolina. That's what Carolina sees here. The doctor, very likely isn't even aware of this. They're just, they turn back just to check something on the screen, then they turn back and they're smiling. So for them, there's no significant piece of action here. But for Carolina, this has significance, okay? And then the doctor asks if they can examine Carolina and starts to put on the latex gloves. Again, for the doctor and for anybody that knows about clinical practice since the 1980s, I guess, is any examination you put on, your latex gloves, the clinical gloves, okay? Carolina doesn't know this, okay? Or she might not know this. So again, she links that to the breaking off of the turn to her, the looking at the screen, the smile dropping, and then the re-engagement, okay, is followed by. So there's a kind of sequence of events. So what I'm trying to suggest here in the paper where I discuss this, I talk about different types of Gestalt, and I talk about, Garfinkel works via Gurvitch with Gestalt Psychology, and he proposes a new kind of Gestalt, if you like, which is a kind of praxeological or interactional Gestalt. Okay, so something like a cue is a Gestalt. Okay, the cue is a social fact or the social unit, and the participants of the cue through their actions constitute the cue. But the cue isn't reducible to the participant, okay, because the participants change, but the cue retains its identity. So Garfinkel talks about praxeological gestalts, and they have in common, they don't have much in common with the pictorial gestalts, but the melodic gestalts, the fact that you can hear a noise in the context of a familiar tune and hear pregnant in it the further movements or the further notes in a tune, okay? And there's something of that going on here. The sequence of these actions becomes a familiar tune for Carolina, okay? So for the doctor, these actions have nothing about them to set them apart from her other contributions to the interaction to that point, okay? The sense they have for the doctor at the point of an action, okay, the turning away, turning back, and then turning back and smiling, and then putting on the gloves. The sense they have for the doctor at the point of an action is as routine acts in an unremarkable unfolding of a routine consultation. For Carolina, one or more of these actions seems to be the object of her anger, and therefore the emergent discord, in that they sequentially precede Carolina's reaction in withdrawing. So for the doctor, her actions have a sense in the contexture that is mundane routine consultation, until Carolina indicates it isn't, and discordance emerges in the proceedings. For Carolina, the doctor's broken off re-engagement and absorbed focus on the screen indicated a move to a different contexture in which the actions are now reframed by her, Carolina's, HIV status. The sequence of actions were experienced by Carolina almost like the familiar opening to a melody. Okay, it's like, oh, I've heard this tune before, right? She's familiar with this when she's been to the spa and she has to fill in a questionnaire for the masseur. And as soon as the masseur sees the fact that she's ticked to say she's HIV positive, the masseur changes the way they interact with her. This is a familiar melody for Carolina. And that's what she's seeing this sequence of actions are, the opening of this, okay? Whereas for the doctor, okay, the doctor hasn't had the experience of living with HIV, hasn't had the experience of being stigmatized when they've disclosed HIV status. So for the doctor, these actions aren't heard in this way, aren't seen, aren't experienced in this way. The contexture for Carolina now splits off from the one of a routine consultation and becomes one of HIV-related degradation. Carolina recognizes such interactions. She's seen them before. The doctor's return to an extended focus on the screen was seen by Carolina as being the moment the doctor registered Carolina's HIV status in her medical records. This action is followed sequentially by the doctor putting on the latex gloves. This is a routine action for a clinician who is about to examine a patient, but this patient had disclosed their status as a person living with HIV on a previous visit, while also being unaware of the routine and required practice of glove wearing when examining all patients in a clinical setting. So that's the end of the analysis. So I guess I want to make a number of points. So the first point is this idea of understanding actions and words as having sense in particular contextures, and that there's a kind of symbiosis between the identity of the contexture. So there's a Gestalt-like quality here between the identity of the contexture as a whole and the actions and utterances that comprise the contexture. Okay. The contexture is read off the utterances and the actions, but the contexture can't be reduced to the utterances and the actions. And the utterances and the actions only have the sense they do in that particular contexture. So there's something here, you know, the idea of language games in Wittgenstein has a similar sort of logic, and the idea of Gestalt contextures has a similar sort of logic here. It's this kind of symbiosis or synchronicity. Okay. So that's one thing, and that's what I want to emphasize about the importance of an interactional analysis of stigma. The other point is the example gives us, this case study gives us, I should probably go close to that. This case study gives us a clear case, and a case that I don't think is exceptional. I mean, maybe the questions will come and somebody will say it is exceptional, but a case where stigma emerges, okay, and it's not down to the intentions of the stigmatizer, okay. The last thing I want to say is that I think the other thing to observe about this is just because the stigma is based on the contexture that Carolina produces in this situation, it's not that there's a right or wrong way to see it. It is. In some ways, the question of right or wrong doesn't occur here, okay? And I think there's something, when people talk about implicit bias and microaggressions and things like this, I think this can be applied here as well, that there's a reality to the stigmatization that Carolina experiences here. And just because the doctor didn't intend to, doesn't detract from the reality of the experience. It doesn't detract from the fact that there was stigma there. It's, if you had a child that when you show them the famous picture of Yastrov's duck rabbit, okay, that Wittgenstein made famous, okay, and they could only ever see a duck, okay, and you could explain that by saying, well, their family keep ducks at home, the kid had duck eggs for breakfast, and they don't know what a rabbit is, so they're always going to see a duck, okay. That explains why they're seeing a duck in the duck rabbit, but it doesn't say that it's right to see a duck or it's wrong to see a duck, okay. So the question of right or wrong here, which often pervades discussions about these kinds of bias or stigmatization, actually shouldn't pollute this environment. There's a reality to the experience of stigma there, and I guess that's the other thing I wanted to bring out. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
It's 2 minutes.
Okay.
Sorry?
Yeah. Can I ask people who are on Zoom if they have a question, if they could put it into the chat box and we can read it from there. Thank you. Okay, does anybody have any questions?
Thank you. Hi, two very quick questions. First of all, thank you for the very compelling and great talk. I was wondering first off, for the case of pride as a form of fighting against the feeling of shame. I know that you discuss this more in depth in your book on shame and philosophy, but I was wondering on the question of the heteronomy and autonomy of shame, would you say that, is it enough to say that we feel with some sense of pride we can conquer shame? And does this lead to some form of like potentially paternalist response to say, well, if you want to stop feeling shame, then you just have to develop a thicker skin and just live a shameless life? And second very quick question, I was wondering about the point you made about the normative reading of the shameful situation with the stigma example you gave in the end. I thought it was very compelling, again, the ambiguity that we could either see a rabbit or the duck and both are correct answers, but say in a situation we see a horse, then that's a wrong answer, right? So we want to keep some form of normative acknowledgement at play by saying that, well, of course, in this situation, Carolina was correct to experience some form of stigma. However, there are situations where our readings are just off. How does your account give an explanation for these type of situations? Thank you very much.
Those are both really great questions, I think, important too. So on the first, yeah, absolutely. You know, it's not, you know, and I think, you know, if we stick with the example of Matthew Hudson tweet, you know, he would say it's not up to him to, he can't exercise control. He can't produce or dictate a contexture, you know, but you can have an input, you know, in the, you know, and that's part of the reason to go for an interactional study is precisely that, is to see how these contextures are produced in interaction, not by, excuse me, not by somebody affirming something. You know, Matthew Hudson's trying to take something into interactions to say, you know, I want to change the way we do things, in the same way that, you know, you can go into any interaction and you can try and, you know, I guess, you know, it goes back to the classical cynic movement and Diogenes of Sinope, that, you know, people who try to change existing social norms by refusing to acknowledge the way they're seen and judged by others around them. You know, and Matthew Hudson's doing that. But yeah, that's very much not to say that he can dictate a situation and he can. Now, I think I would want to stop short of saying that he might, I don't know actually, because I've not spoken to him about it, but when I ran some workshops that Mary facilitated for me just before lockdown on shame and stigma, and we had clinicians and activists and just people living with HIV come to these workshops. We ran them as deliberative fora and we discussed this. And there was one guy came up to me in the Manchester workshop and he was probably in his early 60s, gay man who'd been an activist most of his life. And he said, you know, honestly, I don't experience shame or stigma. So I guess there's a sense in which you know, I wouldn't want to rule out the possibility, but I think you're right. You know, we shouldn't slip into a kind of subjectivism here where we think that people can just, you know, create the world in the way they want the world to be. And as you say, there'd be something rather crass about that, because you'd be telling people who do experience stigma, like Carolina, that in some senses it's their responsibility for the way they saw things. And that would, crass would be the word to, you know, which is why it's probably a good thing to have the two together here, you know. Just remind me of your second point again.
Yeah, I was wondering again about the point you made about there's no such thing as a right or wrong. And I think that in most cases, you're absolutely right. There is a sense of ambiguity.
Oh yeah, you're wanting some sort of limit cases, right. Yeah. Yeah, again, that's precisely right. What I would say, and I think this is probably, my views have probably become a bit more radical in an interactional sense than they were 10 years ago. So I'm kind of more ethnomethodological than Wittgensteinian now. So I would say there's no point in specifying those limits outside the interaction, that we see it. If we want to know these things, you know, it's a kind of, you know, I mean, one way of, you know, quickly summing up ethnomethodology would be to say it's a kind of praxeological or interactional phenomenology, you know, that the phenomena are interactionally produced. But there are, you know, but you see there are constraints within situations, but you only see those by paying close attention to the interactions. I guess that's what I would say.
Thanks, Phil. I hope I'm not interrupting people on Zoom, but it was terrific. Thanks very much. I really love the kind of notion about the shapes that are emerging through this interactional analysis that you're doing. But one of the things that I find, because one of the things I've thought about before in a clinical context is this notion of kind of oscillation between perspectives and between a sense of intersubjectivity and then a subjective objective kind of approach. So I read the doctor's kind of responses here in two ways. One was, in the first instance, yes, a genuine sense of, oh, this is someone with HIV, I have to draw back. So there was that there was a genuine sense that actually Carolina was completely right in reading that. And I don't know that you necessarily mentioned that possibility in your analysis, but I think possibly that was something that might have been happening. A second way of reading that is thinking that the doctor is then shifting into an objective examination, you know, objective kind of perspective. And I think that is one of the flows of clinical consultations, that you shift between that person to person perspective, you know, Martin Buber perhaps, into something that's much more formally a kind of, you know, I'm the professional, you're the body that I need to examine. And then the way of interacting becomes very different. And I think that's entirely correct. And that is the right way that doctors need to work, but they need to be able to make those moves in and out of those kind of different relations through a consultation.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And it is some, I mean, just speaking from my own experience of, you know, being in clinics in those sorts of encounters, I find that quite difficult to deal with. You know, at one moment you feel like you're building rapport, then this person switches, and of course it's essential because you're there, you know, you're there to fill a role, and you need to be professional to do that. That might be the case. I think the key thing, and I think this feeds into my answer to the previous question, is you have to be disciplined with this sort of analysis, and you have to base it on what is open to view in the interaction. So it's possible, you know, one nice thing might be a journal special issue, where you have a case study, and then you get, you know, people to give their own analyses of it. And you could have, you know, somebody such as you who has been in that position where, you know, you have some authority on attributing some intent to the doctor. Whereas if you're doing it from a sort of ethnomethodological perspective, as I'm trying to do, the point is you can't be putting thoughts in the heads of your interactants, if you like. You have to base what you're saying only on what is in view in the interaction. So what you're giving us is the professional vision, if you like, of what a doctor might be doing. And you're right in saying that I leave it kind of ambiguous, because to do otherwise will be for me to start speculating about the motives of the doctor and what they're doing. So I don't even say why the doctor returned to the screen. It could just be, you know, I often do it. I mean, I remember once giving a paper and people kept saying, you kept looking at the clock. And I was looking at the clock all the time because I was aware I was running out of time. But I was so stressed at the time, I wasn't actually seeing the time on the clock. You know, so people can often, you know, do things, and the doctor might well have just, you know, left the screen and looked back at the screen and it being nothing. But in some senses, that's part of the point that, you know, Carolina has what they call in ethnomethodology a kind of unique adequacy here, right? Because she's the person living with HIV. She's had these experiences before. And in other times, they might have been a lot less unambiguous, right? And she's, as I say, she's seeing the familiar opening of a familiar melody when the doctor does this. And, you know, there just is no right and wrong. That is the way she experiences this situation. So, yeah, I think it would be good to have a doctor analyze that scenario and write up their thoughts, yeah, with a sort of professional vision. That would be great, yeah. Thanks.
Just want to take an online question, which is a related question, which is, I suppose, around the power differential in the exchange and whether it's that leads to the rupture.
Yeah, that's possible. I resist invoking power as a term of analysis, partly because, again, the analysis, I don't want to depart from what appears in the interaction. So to invoke power is to kind of overlay a particular sort of theoretical framework, like a sort of Foucauldian framework. And it runs the risk of subjugating the contexture being produced by the participants to the analyst's own agenda. So if power is invoked here, it will be visible in the interaction, and we don't need to overlay that as a framework for identifying that. I think that's how I would respond.
Right. Thank you. Thank you so much, Phil, for this interesting discussions and follow-up questions, which I wanted to think about the intentions or the intentionality. Should we actually think about that? Or because it's here, particularly vulnerability isn't very key thing, right? Especially the Carolina as coming from the HIV status in itself. So the question for me, I'm thinking out loud about the moral responsibility of physicians, especially within the clinical context, is much more there, right? I mean, and what do you think? Much more present, like the moral responsibility of physicians to be more empathetic or thinking about, not idea of, so then the next question is, if there is a moral responsibility, to what extent? Because there is a perceived understanding from Carolina, like this person is stigmatizing or discriminating, but on the other hand, they did not intend it. So what kind of responsibility do you think it has? Thank you.
So I think there's enough, my view on this with this particular case study is there's enough in evidence here that the doctor would want, that is exercising, you know, the amount of moral responsibility that we would want from a doctor. The problem is that the doctor isn't aware of the contexture through which their sequence of actions comes to give this meaning to the putting on of gloves. So I think there's enough in this example that if you were to make the doctor aware of Carolina's perspective, if you like, and the contexture that emerges for Carolina, then that doctor automatically would just preface putting on gloves with, we do this as a routine part of every consultation if we're examining patients, you know, or maybe even bring out into the open to say, you know, I see you're living with HIV, and just, you know, and have a a talk about, say it's, it's good, isn't it, that, I see your viral loads undetectable and, so, your HIV is untransmissible, and, even to have that conversation. But, I think there's enough in this, what we see in this case study to show that the doctor would handle that well, if only they knew how this sequence is experienced by Carolina. So I don't think we need to bring in any kind of moral framework. I think we just need to say, okay, how do we go about getting clinicians to understand the contexture from Carolina's perspective?
Hi, Phil. Thanks for a great talk. So, I mean, many things to discuss here, obviously, but I would like to, push you a bit on the question of right and wrong in Carolina's reaction. I mean, obviously, being judgmental would be a crazy attitude here, but it seems to me that, I wonder how you think about it. I mean, in this case, it's obviously not clear whether her view of the doctor is, as it were, correct, or if she's seeing, sensing the doctor's reactions in a clear manner. But I mean, I'm referring to the possibility here, and this is very, common in shame, I think, or shame proneness. I mean, I walk into a room, let's say I'm giving a talk, and then I sense that there is some, fatal flaw in what I'm doing. Then I sense that everybody is seeing this, and actually I then start detecting signs of their, reactions to this flaw of mine. So I'm just referring to the tendency to kind of, as it were, see these things. Yeah.
I think this just probably comes down to different philosophical predilections. I mean, I really am interactional in that sense that, to me, your sense that the audience is recognizing the flaws in your paper is because you've seen the way. There is no other way than you've seen something in the audience. So I wouldn't, for me, the interaction is where the action is. Not in the head. In that sense, I'm interactional and Wittgensteinian. I wouldn't say that, intentionals are constituted via interaction. They're not, it's not like the intentions are there and then they're put into actions. So that's, but I suspect we'll just disagree on that.
Agree to disagree. Çok güzel bir söz değil mi? Agree to disagree. Çok böyle kafiyeli de. Kafiyeli.
Is that okay? So thanks, Phil. I really enjoyed the talk, and I found it very phenomenological, even though you don't use those terms, but I think that whole analysis could be reframed through a phenomenological register, talking about how one's previous experiences are sedimented into their expectations of co-constituting the reality of that they encounter in interactions and in intersubjectivity. So the question I had when you were defining the relationship or talking about the relationship between shame and stigma, you said, and it was on the slide, shame is part of stigma, or stigma is internal to shame. It is part of what shame is. And I found that a bit problematic because I think there are plenty of experiences of shame that aren't related to stigma. And maybe it's the other way around, that shame is internal to stigma rather than stigma being internal to shame.
Yeah, no, sorry. Yeah, probably my mistake for the way I phrased it. I don't mean that stigma is uniquely shame's object. So shame could have other objects, but and in fact, stigma could lead to other emotions. All I was wanting to emphasize there is the nature of the relationship between shame and stigma is an internal one, such that stigma is a category. But so, for example, an experience of being discredited, socially discredited, is the object of one's shame. So, and it's not that. And what I want to argue is it's not that causes the shame, that they stand externally related, but that it's an internal relation. I mean, I actually think, in Wittgensteinian terms, I would call it a grammatical, because there's problems with internal relation, but the word grammar, when you speak to non-Wittgensteinians, switches people off, so I tend to avoid it. But a meaning relation would be the other way of saying it. It's part of the meaning of your, when you specify emotions and type individuate them and stuff like that, then, there are two ways actually of looking at it. One is in a sort of philosophical way to say it's part of the meaning of the emotion that person is experiencing. The only way you specify it is by specifying the object of the emotion. So that's one way of saying it's internal. The other would be, because you could do it in conversation analytic terms or in grammatical terms, and say it's part of the grammar of emotion, that if someone says, I'm feeling ashamed, that forms a kind of adjacency pair in conversation analytic terms with the question, what are you feeling ashamed about? Okay, and that is a follow-up question, because until you know what someone's feeling ashamed about, you really know very little about what's happened, because the experience is actually ashamed about. So that's all I was wanting to emphasize. But yeah, absolutely, there can be shame can have other objects. So I didn't want to deny that. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Oh, and by the way, on the phenomenological stuff, yeah, I mean, Garfinkel, he talks about misreading phenomenology. He reads Gervich, later on misreads Merleau-Ponty, and reads them as if they're ethnomethodologists and encourages his students to do otherwise. So I guess I am getting more phenomenological. Also recently, I mean, most people probably aren't interested in this at all, but I mean, recently I think actually you have to understand Wittgenstein's change in 1930 is when he engages with phenomenology. He spends 3 months trying to devise a phenomenological language and then dismisses it. And I think that's, and that's just the point that he moves from the Tractarian approach, the atomism, etc., to the later approach. And I think, he refers to his own philosophy for about 5 years as a kind of phenomenology. J.L. Austin actually refers to what he does as linguistic phenomenology. So I think that kind of linguistic philosophy is, it is a type of phenomenology, though it's not usually bracketed in that way. So I think there just are overlaps there and shared interests. So.
I can just shout. Thanks, Phil. Just one brief question. I think in Goffman and in much study of stigma, like studies of prejudice, it's assumed that the imposition of stigma is unjustified and a problem to be dealt with. And I just wonder whether you, in your studies of interactions, have also focused on situations where we could say that the stigma and the shame are rightfully socially present. So the interaction is then about how do people deal with that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. But, it can seem like a cop-out when you really go full in on the interactional stuff, because you just say, well, if you find an interaction in which the analysis shows that to be the case, then yes. So you don't have to make any philosophical proclamations in abstraction from what the particular interactions show. But yeah, I mean, I used to, I'm not sure whether I talked about Thomas was one of the people that invited me to this conference here in 2009. So there's a nice symmetry that you're the last questioner. But I'm not sure whether I talked about this then, but one of the things I talked about around that time, and one of the things I talked about in the book, was that, you know, part of the problem with our politics, and actually this is particularly the case now with the Prime Minister we have in the UK, is a kind of absence of shame. And if we had more shame about what we're doing to the environment and the climate crisis, and where we are in that and how long we've known about that, if we had more shame about that, then we might take more action. So I'm open to that possibility, but I would say it's based on the analysis of the interactions is where the answer would come. So yeah, thanks.